Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining our webinar tonight. Webinar is a partnership between 4 organizations who work together with a number of other organizations to lead a task force in developing the Model Code of Ethics for Educators. I'm delighted to have all of you with us tonight. If you haven't participated in this Zoom meeting before, either at the top of your screen or at the lower left-hand corner of your screen, depending on your computer, you should be able to pull up a control box. And in the control box, you will eventually be able to unmute yourself when we're going to open things up for discussion. I will unmute everybody at that point as well. Right now, I have everyone except the presenters muted. You will also see a chat box, and a couple of us are already chatting through the chat box. Please feel free to use that throughout the presentation and discussion. So the 4 organizations who were involved in the development of the Model Code of Ethics for Educators, just give me a second, I'm having a minor technical difficulty here, are represented by our presenters this evening. Dr. Troy Hutchings is the Senior Strategic Advisor for Educator Ethics at Educational Testing Service. Anne Marie Fenton is the Director of Assessment at the Georgia Professional Standards Commission, and Anne Marie is representing the National Association of State Directors of Teacher Education and Certification on our webinar this evening. Leanne Stevens and Jay Hoffman in the center of your screen are 2 members of the educator task force that developed the code. Leanne is an equity coach in Leanne, I'll probably screw this up and I'll ask you to correct me because I always do, in St. Paul School District in Minnesota?
Yeah, close. St. Louis Park.
Thank you. St. Louis Park School District in Minnesota. And Jay Hoffman is a technology specialist in New Hampshire. Leanne is the Minnesota State Teacher of the Year 2007, and Jay is the New Hampshire State Teacher, Jay is the Vermont State Teacher of the Year 2013.
Thank you.
And then finally on the screen, Dr. Ashley Norris is the Dean of Specialized Programs at the University of Phoenix School of Education. So the 4 partners in this work were NSTOY. Leanne and Jay are representing NSTOY. NASDAQ, which led the work, and Anne Marie is representing NASDAQ. Educational Testing Service, represented by Troy, and University of Phoenix, represented by Ashley. So I am now going to turn things over to Troy, who's going to start us out by talking about how we became involved in this work, individually and jointly, through the need for a Model Code of Ethics for Educators.
Thank you very much. In describing the need and why our profession really needs a code of ethics for educators, it really doesn't take much but 5 questions. Imagine a profession, and that would be any profession other than education. Imagine a profession in which there's not a code of ethics to guide personal decision making. Imagine a profession in which the policies, the statutes, and regulations that govern practitioners' conduct are not even known by the practitioners. Would you even call it a profession? And what if that profession's practitioners make numerous decisions in a day that directly impact a highly vulnerable population, yet they've never been prepared in ethical decision making? And what if that profession's practitioners are not aware of the professional risk and vulnerabilities that are inherent in the profession, yet they're expected to address the academic, personal, and social needs of hundreds of individuals in a day? And what if that profession's practitioners have in loco parentis responsibilities, yet they have never received training in supervisory liability? The germane question then becomes, would you even call it a profession? Well, unfortunately, that has traditionally been the state of education in the United States. Other professions, especially fiduciary professions, have had professional codes of ethics dating all the way back to 1847. So the American Medical Association developed their very first code of ethics 168 years ago. The American Bar Association developed in 1932 their 30 initial canons of responsibility, which became their code of ethics. The American Psychological Association, after extensive research, developed a code of ethics in 1952. The American Counseling Association in 1961. And of course, a whole host of other professions, including financial fiduciaries, law enforcement agencies, and again, others, have developed not only a code of ethics, but as a starting point, a code of ethics, then followed by intensive training at the pre-service level, the licensure level, and at the in-service level. And the question then becomes again, why have professional ethical standards that are encapsulated and embodied in ethics as well as training and professional development? Well, the American Counseling Association really came up with 4 reasons, and I've changed the wording so that it really defines educators. And these 4 reasons really stand: to clarify to current and future teachers and to those they serve the nature of the ethical responsibilities held in common by all educators, not just teachers, but everybody that interacts with students. Establish principles that define ethical behavior and ethical best practice. Serve as an ethical guide designed to assist educators in constructing the best course of action. And finally, serve as a basis for educated learning, accountability, and remediation. Kenneth Pope, who's an ethicist with the American Psychological Association, really admonishes all professional organizations to be careful with a code of ethics, because a code of ethics should not be prescriptive. Awareness of the ethics codes, he says, is crucial to the competence in the area of ethics. But most importantly, the formal standards, the code of ethics, are not a substitute for an active, deliberative, and creative approach to fulfilling our ethical responsibilities. They prompt, they guide, and they should inform our ethical consideration, but they do not serve as a substitute for it. There is no way that the codes and the principles can be effectively followed or applied in a rote, thoughtless manner. Each situation is unique and is likely to change significantly over time. That's a key admonishment for us to remember. The code of ethics is not a prescription, it's not formulaic, and it's certainly not a recipe. It really is an opportunity to reframe the questions to guide our decision making, a collective spirit, if you will, that should guide our decision making, and it gives our profession permission to have difficult conversations about the multitude of decisions that teachers make every single day. And finally, once again, why have professional ethical standards? Well, a great quotation from 1915, exactly 100 years ago, was stated by the Ontario Minister of Education. He said this: "No profession can really exist without a code of ethics to guide the conduct of its members. Doctors, lawyers, and clergymen have their ethical codes. Teachers can scarcely be said to have such a code until they have developed a professional spirit, until they have developed a professional spirit which is characterized by loyalty to the recognized standards. They cannot rank with the learned professions." Such an important thing to say. Well, on June 25th, at the National Press Club on Capitol Hill in Washington, D.C., we can say 100 years ago, after the Minister of Education made this statement, we are now a profession with a code of ethics.
Thank you, Troy, for that introduction and for that rationale for the establishment of this code. And at this point, I'm going to ask Anne-Marie Fenton to take us on the journey.
That's the guy that said, "How come we did not invite him?" Because that's of John Brad.
And I'm getting a little bit of interference. I'm sure it's muted. NASDAQ, as Catherine said, is the National Association of State Directors of Teacher Education and Certification. It is the organization that represents professional standards boards and commissions and state departments of education in all 50 states, as well as many other jurisdictions. It promotes high standards for educators, teacher mobility across state lines, comprehensive personnel screening, clearinghouse on teacher discipline. What is so critical to this work in developing the Model Code of Ethics for Educators is its mission to exercise leadership in matters related to preparation and certification of professional school personnel. And it has taken the lead actually since 1928, since its inception, in fostering communication regarding professional practices across these jurisdictional lines mentioned to help ensure the safety of children in P-12 classrooms. Let's take a look at the little bit of history. So I'm going to give you a brief history lesson. In 1928, NASDAQ was founded and had held its first annual conference. And we jump ahead, way ahead to 1996 when the NASDAQ created a Professional Practices Institute. Now, amazingly, the Professional Practices Institute is going very, very strong and to have started so early. In 1987, NASDAQ's clearinghouse became fully operational. Many of you may think of NASDAQ's clearinghouse when you think of NASDAQ. Just know that there's a lot more there. In 2009, the Professional Practices Institute representatives began this discussion of, hey, this profession needs to be a profession, and therefore it needs a model code of ethics in order to be a profession. So discussion began as early as 2009. 2012, NASDAQ's Educator Ethics Exploratory Conference was held, hosted in collaboration with ETS, and that work laid a great framework and groundwork for the resulting Model Code of Ethics for Educators 2-3 years later. In 2013, the publication of INSTOY's white paper, Reimagining 5 Structures to Transform the Profession.
Oh, so you want us to send you a congratulations
for educators. Team, so NASDAQ's preparation program and continue a nationwide ethics survey.
What food do you want us to take?
Andrea, excuse me for 1 second.
Okay.
If you're not muted, could you please mute yourself? I have,
What do you want us to contribute?
but it sounds like some people may have found a way to unmute themselves, and we're getting a lot of background noise.
Options.
Okay.
But
This is for the NK. This is the NK party. Okay.
yeah. But a good photo.
We still have someone who is not muted.
Oh, sorry.
Thank you.
Thank you. And you can as you saw on the slide, and I know that may have been distracting, the NASDAQ appointed in 2013, and this is a pivotal piece, a Model Code of Ethics for Educators Steering Committee to realize the work that really began in 1928, 1996, 2009, 2012. Then in 2014, the first meeting of the Model Code of Ethics for Educators Communication Partners was held. Those partners recommended task force members for this, not to represent their organizations, but they recommended individuals to serve in this great collaborative work of a model code. And then we held the first meeting in 2014 of the Model Code of Ethics for Educators Task Force. Excuse me. And finally, coming up to 2015, the MCEE, as Troy said earlier, completed, the task force completed the Model Code of Ethics work. It was adopted by the NASDAQ Executive Board, we are very proud to say, in June. And then they have formed a National Council for the Advancement of Educator Ethics, and you'll be hearing about that work in a moment. Let's talk very briefly about guiding the work. The steering committee that was formed back in 2013 began to put a proposal together for this work, and we worked on the scope of work. We met with communication partners, and again, the task force was nominated and selected. Who are these communication partners? Catherine has put their names in front of you, and even though there were many other players, contributors, if you will, to this work, you see, and I'm not going to read the list, but you can see that this was a very representative collection of educational organizations. And then let's not forget our sponsors who made this work possible, and that would be ETS, INSTOY, and the University of Phoenix, and we certainly thank them for helping launch this, make this task force work possible. I'm not going to read the task force members' names, but we do want to put them in front of you to honor the wonderful commitment they made to this work. And you can see them. They were representative of teachers and paraprofessional, principals, superintendents. These are individuals doing the work in schools. And we also had some NASDAQ State Department representatives from each of the 4 NASDAQ regions also serving on the task force. And then a facilitation team, as you see, Catherine Bassett, myself, Troy Hutchings was our subject matter expert, and of course, Katie Natalie helped to put this work on paper. We also want to thank our NASDAQ staff, as you see before you, Carolyn Angelo, Mike Carr, and of course, the executive director, Phil Rogers. It's fun to show a picture, so we have to show this picture to you of the Model Code of Ethics for Educators Task Force. I'm going to now turn it back over to Catherine, who's going to take us through the development process. Catherine?
Sure. So in our development process, we followed a methodology called evidence-centered design. We convened our task force, and using ECD methodology, we first unpacked a huge variety of other principles from professions, including the ones that we typically think of when we think of professional principles like medicine and law, the American Psychological Association, some of the others that Troy mentioned. But we also looked at professions like the vocational professions, the electrical workers organization, the plumbing organization, etc. In all, we looked at over 45 different sets of codes. So we looked at the model codes of ethics for over 40 different professions, and we unpacked those codes. The task force, the educator task force, then worked to define the population so that we had a clear understanding of who we were talking about when we said educators, model code of ethics for educators. And we wanted to make certain that we understood that we were talking about teachers, but we were talking about other educators as well. And that's why it was so important for us to have those other education fields represented on the task force. After we had unpacked principles from other professions and defined a population, we started to identify key content that we had found in those principles from other professions that we believe might apply to educators. As we drafted sets of initial principles, we did cross-review so that each small group that was working in a particular area was looking at the work of other areas to eliminate any redundancy and to look for gaps in what we were doing. We wrote the auxiliary pieces that accompany the code, so things like a policy statement, a mission, a vision, etc. And you can see those pieces on the NASDAQ website. I sent you the link this morning. We then cross-reviewed those pieces. We went out to public comment and collected public comment from over 300 individuals or organizations. Some organizations chose to submit their public comment on behalf of the organization rather than as a group of distinct individuals. In looking at the public comment feedback, we then reviewed, revised, and finalized, and I can tell you that revisions were significant after the public comment, and we then moved forward into a publication process. So at this point, we'd like to start to dig into the code itself, and in order to do that, I'm going to ask each of our representatives this evening to take one of the principles and unpack it for you. So I'm going to start with Troy, or excuse me, we're going to move first to Jay, and he's going to give us an overview of the code, and then we'll move to Troy. Jay?
Yeah, so can we put the graphic up for us there, Catherine?
Here we go.
That's what I like. So here's your visual graphic of the principles, and you see in the center the column, and that's the mainstay, our model code of ethics for educators. It's foundational to our practice. It's what we build upon. And then circling around that are 4 principles. And then the outermost ring, you'll notice, is the responsibility to the profession. This is the common language. This is such a key principle. It's the common language that we all must share together. What it does is it leaves out our individual values and those things that guide us individually and gives us something shared. So this becomes a really, really important piece, the responsibility we all have to the profession, and that is to have command of our education ethics. Troy, back to you.
Thank you, Jay. Appreciate that. What we have again is 5 principles, and the very first principle is called the responsibility to the profession. And a descriptor or the principle statement is as follows. The professional educator is aware that trust in the profession depends upon a level of professional conduct and responsibility that may be higher than required by law. Again, ethics is a higher threshold than law. This entails holding oneself and other educators to the same ethical standards. Now, underneath that descriptor, when you go and were to actually look at the Code of Ethics, you would find 3 categories. Under each one of these 3 categories, there would be a number of different indicators. But we're just going to read over the categories so you can see, and then you can examine the indicators later on your own, because there are 10 pages of indicators. The professional educator demonstrates professional responsibility to oneself as an ethical professional. The professional educator fulfills the obligation to address and attempt to resolve ethical issues. The professional educator promotes and advances the profession within and beyond the school community.
And we're now going to move to Principle 2.
Thank you. Principle 2, responsibility for professional competence. The professional educator is committed to the highest levels of professional and ethical practice, a pretty profound statement, including demonstration of the knowledge, skills, and dispositions required for professional competence. And underneath that, again, as Troy said, you can go to NASDAQ.net to see the full code, and we'll have that up on the screen for you. The indicators are the professional educator demonstrates commitment to high standards of practice. The professional educator demonstrates responsible use of data, materials, research, and assessment. And the professional educator acts in the best interest of all students.
Thank you, Anne Marie. And we'll now move to Principle 3. Leanne?
Yeah, so Principle 3, responsibility to students. This is actually my favorite because without students, we wouldn't have a profession. The professional educator has a primary obligation to treat students with dignity and respect. The professional educator promotes the health, safety, and well-being of students by establishing and maintaining appropriate verbal, physical, emotional, and social boundaries. And under responsibility to students, we have the professional educator respects the rights and dignity of students. The professional educator demonstrates an ethic of care. The professional educator maintains student trust and confidentiality when interacting with students in developmentally appropriate manner and within appropriate limits.
Thank you, Leanne. And moving to Principle number 4. Ashley?
Yes. Principle number 4, responsibility to the school community. The professional educator promotes positive relationships and effective interactions with members of the school community while maintaining professional boundaries. The categories under responsibility to the school community are the professional educator promotes effective and appropriate relationships with parents, guardians. The professional educator promotes effective and appropriate relationships with colleagues. The professional educator promotes effective and appropriate relationships with the community and other stakeholders. The professional educator promotes effective and appropriate relationships with employers. The professional educator understands the problematic nature of multiple relationships.
Thank you. And Jay, Principle 5.
Principle 5, responsible and ethical use of technology. The professional educator considers the impact of consuming, creating, distributing, and communicating information through all technologies. The ethical educator is vigilant to ensure appropriate boundaries of time, place, and role are maintained when using electronic communication. The following indicators are: a professional educator uses technology in a responsible. B, the professional educator ensures students' safety and well-being when using technology. And C, the professional educator maintains confidentiality in the use of technology. And finally, the professional educator promotes the appropriate use of technology in educational settings.
Thank you. And Leanne is now going to walk you through a protocol that you can use if you wish to unpack the principles with your own group.
So, protocol for unpacking the principles. So we know that there's a lot of information there that we have to kind of decipher. And so this is a good tool that you can use with, your stakeholders, your constituents, staff. So the first thing you can do is go through the principles, or you can start with the first principle. So it's however you want to organize it. And you can start with the first principle and have them underline the noun. So kind of what nouns jump out at them. And then the next piece, they could circle the verb. So what are some of the action words that are in there that jump out at them as well? And then start to discuss, for that principle, what is the heart of the principle? So what is this principle getting to? What's the main piece of it? What's the meat of that principle? And then 2 to 3 behaviors that an educator would need to be aware of in order to navigate the principle. And then what ethical dilemmas do you see for educators in regard to this principle? So it's just a tool. There are other tools I'm sure that people have to use, but this would be a really good tool when you're unpacking the principles.
And I had sent out a link to all of the people who were registered for the webinar as of this morning to the NASDAQ website, where you can access the full document with all of the principles and their indicators in total, as well as the accompanying material that goes along with the code with the principles themselves. At this point, I'd like to ask each of our presenters to share out from their own perspective, because they have 5 very unique perspectives, why this work was so important to them. And Troy and Ashley, I'm going to start with you. Why was this work important to you as professional educators at the higher education level, Troy, at least when we started the work? And why is it important to you as researchers? Troy, would you like to start?
Yeah, absolutely. As someone who's really examined the literature quite thoroughly, not just regarding educator ethics, but also professional ethics and other professions, I can honestly say that this code then, it actualizes and operationalizes the actual research. So what we're seeing is a real code of ethics that's been actually vetted through research-based ethical dilemmas that have been captured from teachers all over, and we have discovered through research that this actually does assist teachers with their assist educators with their ethical decision making, and we're just really excited by that.
Thank you, Troy. Ashley?
Sure. I will give a little bit from 2 different perspectives. One, I actually have training in counseling and psychology. So, I'm trained in the APA ethical guidelines. And one of the biggest things for me as a higher education administrator, and especially for teacher prep programs, is to be able to give a reference, to give some guidance, a document that truly prepares teachers to feel confident in their decisions and to have ethical principles and guidelines to which they can refer. As a researcher, which Troy gave some highlights of the study that we did, discussions with teachers across the country, is that, like Troy said, the code really, aligns perfectly to some of the findings, and just giving teachers that guideline and truly a reference where they can feel confident making decisions and they can use it as a resource in their everyday practice.
Thank you, Ashley. Anne Marie, coming from the perspective of a state education agency staff member, why is this important to you?
Thank you, Catherine. Looking at across the effective school staffing continuum, when you think about recruiting, educate people into the field of education, when you think about preparation, when you think about induction and the professional learning of your in-service teachers up through renewal of in-service teachers, so belong pre-service to in-service, and not just teachers, but leaders, educators. It's important to the state, of course, to ensure that along that path that the knowledge, skills, and dispositions we focus on those. What we also need to focus on, and what that model code of ethics for educators prepares and provides for us, are the ethical principles to guide the many decisions that educators must make, both as pre-service educators, as you may remember from your own experiences, and in-service educators. So this code provides states with additional information, additional guidance, additional principles that can work well with their state's code of ethics or conducts that they each have adopted. That's a critical piece of what's important to a state. Also, as ethical leaders that you all are in your own schools, jurisdictions, organizations, you do have a wonderful shared opportunity for and a professional responsibility to not only yourselves and those with whom you work, and I'm speaking inclusively of all of us here, but to the profession. And that's where our state and all states and jurisdictions can really focus on intentional prevention, outreach, education that this model code of ethics provides.
Thank you, Anne Marie. And I'd like to turn now to our two classroom educators. Leanne, particularly in your role this year as an equity coach, why is this code important to you?
Yes, especially in my role as an equity coach, because I am coaching not only some veteran teachers, but also brand new teachers. And the code of ethics is something, first of all, for me, that I feel is very needed, very meaningful, and very transformative. I think it will transform our practice. And I think it's not that it's a code of conduct. So that was really important to me. It wasn't a code of conduct. It's not mandating behavior, but it's giving us pause to think. And I think so often we have some struggles with what is like the right thing to do, or what we have the right to do. And so this will be a guide that I can share with my new teachers, particularly, so that they can get a really good, I think, a good start in our profession.
Thank you, Leanne. And Jay, after you share your thoughts, we do have a question that I think you would be the best person to answer in our chat box. So will you go ahead?
Okay. So there's so much anxiety by teachers today, and I'm going to talk to you from a technology perspective. Technologies are advancing more rapidly than teachers are learning what the ins and outs of them are, what the impacts are. I'm excited about the Educator Code of Ethics because it teaches trajectory thinking. If I do this, then possibly this can happen. And it's a whole new way of thinking. And what it does is it takes the anxiety out of teaching. I'll piggyback on to what Leanne said. It's not about our usual code of conduct, which is don't do this, don't do that. It actually is a guide. It helps us think through possible ethical dilemmas, and it helps us to think forward. And when we can do that, when we have something we can think about, it removes the anxiety in our profession. It helps us to maintain a safe course, if you will, safety for our students and safety for ourselves as well. And I think that's huge. And so I see this as a tremendous breakthrough.
And Jay, I'm glad that you answered that question through the lens of technology, because that's what our chat box question deals with. The question is, how do you maintain confidentiality using tech tools like social media? And what are the formal guidelines, especially for teachers, school counselors, parent liaisons, and other school-based staff?
So the first thing you need to do is defer to your school your school outlines. Every school has an outline on how to handle confidentiality. You have to really be aware of FERPA and your Information Opportunity Act. You have to be aware of what your school has outlined for you and following that. It's really, really important. Every school has a specific outline and a way for you to handle yourself online with private information. And you also have to consider third-party privacy too. And all of that should be outlined with your school. Now, the Code of Ethics help us to work through that. It gives you these points to think about. And if you don't know these channels, and if you don't think your school has one, then go to the proper person in the school, begin to work your way up line and ask about it and ask for it.
Thank you, Jay. So at this point, I'm going to unmute everybody. And if you have questions, I'm going to ask that you respectfully wait your turn and ask your question. So everyone is, well, this might be a mistake, but I did unmute everybody. I think I'll go ahead and mute everyone again. And if you have a question, ask you to go in and unmute yourself and ask it. And I, in the meantime, will unmute the presenters. Any questions? I'm a middle school teacher. I have good wait time. Okay, if there are no questions, then thank you all so much for participating in our webinar this evening. I did send out the link this morning to all of the registered webinar participants. I'm seeing in the chat box that some people did not receive it. Some people are telling me they registered late. Some people simply didn't get it. I sent the email to the email address that you registered with. So I will send it again as soon as the webinar is over. If you don't receive it and would like to, I will ask that you email me. And my email is Catherine, Katherine, at nstoy, NNSTOY.org. Thank you all so much for your interest in this topic, for your participation, and we look forward to continuing the conversation. Thank you. Good night.